On May 2, 1972, Shoshone County was host to one of the worst mining disasters in modern history. A fire would break out in the Sunshine Mine near Kellogg, Idaho during the day shift. The surprise inferno would compound with ventilation issues and toxic construction materials, rapidly filling the mine with poisonous levels of carbon monoxide. The rescue efforts over the following 11 days brought both national attention and assistance to the tragedy in the Coeur D'alenes, seeing 91 men out of the 173-man shift perish underground, forever changing the lives of their families, their surrounding towns, and the mining industry as a whole. The original claim, the Yankee Lode, was staked by brothers True and Dennis Blake in September of 1884. Being only opportunistic farmers looking for a more lucrative avenue to make money, they worked the ore bodies Yankee Boy and Yankee Girl modestly until their advancing age stopped further progress. The mine would be leased and acquired by several individuals over the next several years, with each owner advancing the mine a bit until in 1918 the Sunshine Mining Company was officially formed. The company would greatly expand the mine, constructing a mill and expanding a new tunnel from the surface. The hard rock would continue to prove rich in silver, and by 1937, Sunshine was producing more silver than any other mine in the world. Continued exploration would find multiple rich ore veins below, allowing the company to dive into further mining and similar commodity investments. Unfortunately, many of the other ventures didn't share Sunshine's success, leading to a rocky relationship between shareholders and company leadership. Company politics having little to nothing to do with the work underground, this sets the scene we find ourselves in on the May morning in 1972. Multiple failed ventures and a drop in silver price fuel a shareholders meeting in Coeur D'alenes. As the company management is attempting to explain a drop in stock price, several million in losses, and increased expenses, tension in the room is palpable. Suddenly, a secretary steps into the room and quickly notifies the mine personnel in attendance that they're needed at the mine immediately for a fire. The meeting would be cut short, with the mine staff ensuring shareholders that all miners would be evacuated. Day shift would start at 7 a.m. that morning. Most guys would be in a half hour early. The 173 miners making up that day's shift mostly hailed from the nearby towns that line the Silver Valley. Kellogg, being the closest real town to the mine, only around a 15-minute drive to the Sunshine Mine, housed most of the miners. After arriving and changing to mine gear in the locker room above ground, the miners would enter a 200-foot-long tunnel on foot until they reached the jewel shaft. From here, a hoist would lower them down to the working levels of the mine. This shaft extended from the 3100 level all the way to the bottom of the mine at 6,020 feet below the surface. Current production was maintained from the 4,000 level to the 5,200 level, with some exploratory work down to the 5,800 level. Most men would start their day on the 3,700 level before they would head to their current working area of the mine. The 3,700 level would house a number of shops that different specialties would use to store and repair or maintain tools and equipment that they needed for their work. This level would also house the Blue Room, named for the pastel blue paint covering the walls. This was the supervisor's room and would see them often sit with the superintendent to discuss work plans and progress. The morning hours go as usual, but with the superintendent at the shareholders meeting in Coeur D'alenes, today's lunchtime planning session only includes foremen: Harvey Dione, Jim Bush, Bob Bush, Jim Sawyer, and Gene Johnson. At 11:45 a.m., an electrician, Gary Becks, would step out of the electric shop and immediately smelled smoke. He turned back inside and notified his boss, Arnold Anderson. Anderson set out to investigate and immediately saw smoke in the main drift and yelled for the shift bosses in the Blue Room. Another miner, Norman Ulrich, joined Anderson and the two foremen, Harvey Dione and Bob Bush, as they set off looking for a source. They walked into the smoke a ways until they could see it was pouring in down the 919 raise. They inspected it a bit but couldn't see any fire from where they were, only thick, acrid smoke. Jim Bush then arrived on a battery-powered locomotive and picked up both Dione and Ulrich and proceeded toward the jewel shaft. On the way, they encountered Ronald Stansbury, a haulage locomotive operator, and instructed him to go back and close the fire door on the jewel shaft. Ulrich accompanied him, and they manually closed the door before continuing up the jewel shaft to the 3100 station. Jim Bush and Harvey Dione headed back toward the 919 raise. Smoke in a mine happened on occasion. Occasionally an electric motor would burn up, or something would accidentally be lit by a drop-top metal or a torch. But generally by the time you smelled or on the rare occasion saw smoke, the fire had already been dealt with and there was little cause for alarm. Unlike the coal mines and other portions of the country, the hard rock isn't inherently flammable. While the air temperatures in the mines can easily exceed 100 degrees, there is almost always a layer of mud up to several inches of standing water across the floor of the tunnels. A typical wood-burning fire has a difficult time spreading in a hard rock mine, aside from timbered vertical shafts. Not impossible for fire to take hold, as several had occurred even at the sunshine itself, but to that point no fire at the mine had proven fatal. This fire, however, was already producing an alarming amount of smoke. Carbon monoxide is an odorless and colorless gas formed by the incomplete combustion of fuels. When too much carbon monoxide is in the air you're breathing, your body replaces the oxygen in your red blood cells with carbon monoxide. This can lead to serious tissue damage or even death. A tightly enclosed space makes the buildup worse. Carbon monoxide poisoning affects the brain and heart the most. Symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning can include headache, dizziness, weakness, nausea or vomiting, shortness of breath, confusion, drowsiness, blurred vision, loss of muscle control, and loss of consciousness. The foreman quickly determined that the fire was above the 3700 level and was threatening to contaminate the air in the number 10 shaft that also served as the source of fresh air throughout the rest of the mine. The 3700 already being heavily contaminated wouldn't be a viable escape route, and so the 3100 was picked as the main egress. Gene Johnson and Bob Bush quickly set out to evacuate the men underground, telling them to run to the Jewel shaft through the 3100, while Jim Bush and Harvey Dione headed toward the Jewel fire door to prevent smoke spilling into the Jewel shaft as men attempted to escape. Jim Sawyer sat in the blue room dialing all the different shops in the mine trying to find a source for the fire. Gene, knowing that time was precious, ran down to the station and made the call to the surface machine shop and told the maintenance foreman Thomas Hara to alert the mine safety engineer Robert Lonhart to activate the stench warning system and bring the self-contained breathing apparatuses to the 3100 level number 10 station for the foreman to use during the evacuation. Thomas would immediately alert the engineer, who would at once rush to the compressor room to begin the evacuation process. The stench is a warning system that injects a foul-smelling chemical into the compressed air lines throughout the mine. Said to smell like rotting cabbage and garlic, it serves to warn men underground in areas that an audible alarm isn't feasible. After releasing the odorous alert, Robert, along with several other surface workers, would pack the 45-pound breathing apparatus to the mine portal. Back underground, as the smoke starts to thicken on the 3700 level, Don Beener assists the other miners in donning their rebreathers. Not the same as a self-contained system with a tank, a rebreather operates using a chemical reaction to pull carbon monoxide from the air, making it safer to breathe. Not everyone underground at the time was familiar with rebreathers, and several that had been stored underground for more extended time were corroded and very difficult to activate, sometimes requiring the operator to strike the metal button with a pipe wrench rather than a thumb press. Another issue with the rebreathers available at the time was their tendency to generate immense amounts of heat in correlation to the carbon monoxide they'd encounter. This meant the more deadly gas many of the miners went into, the hotter the metal mouthpieces would get, quickly exceeding several hundred degrees, blistering the mouth of the wearer. Between the hot metal and the hot air, many were not sure if theirs were even working properly, and would often take them out at times or abandon them altogether. The main conveyance up from the bottom levels of the mine was the chippy hoist, a large hoist capable of carrying 48 men at once. Unfortunately, the operator, Don Wood, was quickly forced out of his hoist room. A rope raise carried smoke directly from the fire area into his hoist room. Survivors recounted Don puking into the main drift, an early sign of the poison gas he had already been lethally exposed to. With the main hoist unusable, the evacuation would be carried out by the two smaller hoists, only able to carry 10 at a time. Gene Johnson would arrive at one of the smaller hoist control rooms to tell Ira Sliger, one of the cage operators running the south cage, to set to work pulling men up from below. Simultaneously, Roger Finley would call Sliger, telling him 3 men were stranded on the 4500 level because the chippy hoist signals weren't working. At 12:03 p.m., he would dump the ore he was carrying and lower his cage to pick up his young cager Byron Schultz from the 5600, before lifting 3 men from 4400 to 3700, where several more would join for the last leg up to the 3100, where they would disembark to evacuate the mine. Ira would then get another load of men from the 3700 level and bring them to the 3100 as well. One of these men was Greg Dione, the young adult son of foreman Harvey Dione. He would reboard the cage to act as his cager and assist those trying to escape. Greg was not employed as a cager at the time, he was a pipe fitter, but he had previously been trained as one and understood they needed to get as many people off the lower levels as possible and fast. As Jim Bush made his way back toward the number 10 shaft from evacuating the 3700 level, he encountered his brother Bob Bush, Wayne Blalock, and Pat Hobson in the smoke, all extremely exhausted and struggling to fight the carbon monoxide poisoning their bodies. Jim knew they were in bad shape and immediately took his brother and Pat Hobson over his shoulders and began half carrying them out while pushing Wayne Blalock in front of him. By the time that they were only halfway back to the shaft, Jim knew he was in real trouble. His legs were jelly and his head was spinning. He would trip and find himself entirely unable to relift his brother back up. The only hope they had was if he went and got help. The foreman crawled forward until he could stumble to his feet, then continued shambling back toward the Jewel until he encountered Harvey Dione, Roberto Diaz, Ronald Stansbury, and Richard Nickleby. He explained to them where the three men were laying down on the track, and the four immediately set off in a locomotive to retrieve the fallen men. Unable to see in the dark, the driver of the locomotive struck one of the downed men and derailed the track car. The four men quickly attempted to put the locomotive back on the tracks, but multiple times failed. Knowing this wasn't a difficult task for two men normally, Dione realized they were fading fast and told everyone to get out immediately. As they were trying to get out, Paul Johnson would collapse. Nickleby ran to try and get him up, but found he couldn't muster any strength. He would look to Diaz in time to see him also sink to the floor. Nickleby struggled to his feet and set off as fast as he could toward the fresher air of the number 5 shaft. Stansbury would be a few seconds behind him. He too would unsuccessfully attempt to assist the fallen men, but also had to abandon that after he found himself blacking out. The three surviving men would take a few moments to collect themselves in the breathable air, as the painful realization would set in. There was nothing they could do. On the 4800 level, Ron Flory and Tom Wilkinson are working as Jippo miners. As the pair are slushing away, Dennis Clapp, a miner from one of the upper levels, climbed down a set of ladders from above and flashed his cap light at them to attempt to get their attention. Once achieved, he warned them of the fire in the upper levels and that they needed to warn the other miners on their level to evacuate. The partners raced over a mile on one of the electric motors to warn two miners working in remote areas of the mine. By the time the four would reach the station, it was already blanketed in smoke, with a group waiting for the hoist. They passed out rebreathers but couldn't determine if they were in working order. The smoke was becoming more intense, and it was ultimately decided that 2 men would stay at the station and the other 7 would wait for the hoist from further away in the fresh air. As they waited, they attempted to divert the smoke by closing 2 nearby air doors. The men would struggle with the changing air pressures opening and closing the air doors until Tom would suddenly collapse. Ron and Allison would attempt to lift the fallen miner, but it was no use. They lacked the strength even for his meager 140-pound frame. Ron ran back and told the other men waiting to get an electric cart and help retrieve Tom. Then he ran back to the station to bell the emergency tone for the hoist. Ron stood as long as he could waiting, but as his legs turned rubbery, he headed back to the motor barn and the fresh air where the others waited. When he returned, Tom was still unconscious. He decided to get him further into the drift where he believed the air may be better quality. Ron drove Tom to a clear portion of the mine on one of the electric carts. When he was still out once they arrived, Ron slapped his partner several times until he came to. The two would sit regaining their strength for about 15 minutes before the agonizing wait for the hoist was too much to bear again. Ron would start to walk back towards the others waiting for the hoist until he saw 2 electric carts sitting motionless in the distance. As he got closer, he realized there were multiple people on the ground next to the carts. He ran back to get Tom, and they would return to the downed men. They tried to shake the first man awake, but quickly realized they were becoming overwhelmed by the poisonous smoke once again and had to abandon their efforts. They counted only 4 men around the carts and were left to hope that the 3 others had found somewhere else to hold out, and hope that the cage hadn't come and left without them. Dusty Rhodes and Arnold Anderson, being lead electricians, knew that someone might have to cut power to the fans operating the main ventilation system. The 2 men agreed to go down together to the 3400 level to stand by to kill the power. They would await permission from mine leadership, repeatedly requesting the go-ahead to pull the plug, but without knowing for certain how it would affect the men still underground when the air movement changed, no one was willing to make the call. The 2 men would stand by gallantly, but would never receive the approval to turn off the power to the fans. Both men would perish in the control room. By 12:35, the smoke was getting to the hoistman Ira. The 61-year-old hoistman suffered from silicosis and had had one lung removed as a result. He managed to hold out, clearing multiple levels before it became too much for him. Bob Scanlon would step in and take over the hoist work. Gene Johnson worked tirelessly trying to coordinate as many men coming off as he could. Charlie Castile and Virgil Bebb assisted in pulling the dazed miners off the hoist so it could rapidly be dropped down again. The only direction provided was the only one needed: run to the Jewel and don't look back. Gene then instructed Al Smith to use the muck carts to transport the men that couldn't make the walk up to the Jewel. Greg Dione and Byron Schultz would disembark the hoist as the smoke would continue to thicken in the air. Gene, feeling he wasn't getting any benefit from the rebreather, threw it down saying this thing isn't worth a good goddamn. Gene gave a set of instructions for Schultz to relay to the hoistman. When Schultz approached Scanlon, he could see the hoist operator shaking. Scanlon requested a rebreather and Schultz set it up for him, buying a few more minutes to get people out. Roger Finley stood counting men as they got off the hoist. As he turned to give his count to Gene Johnson, he would watch the foreman collapse before him. Castillo broke his horrified trance by yelling, "Run to the Jewel." The 19-year-old cager would take off with Castillo and Bebb following behind, realizing they couldn't do anything further to help at the 3100 station. Byron Schultz would stay alongside the hoistman until he finally watched in horror as Scanlon convulsed and slumped over in the control seat. He exited the hoist cabin and was horrified to find several men unconscious on the floor. Schultz ran to Gene Johnson feeling for a pulse, but only finding a faint beat. Running back to the hoist for a fresh rebreather, he came across Douglas Weidrich. Schultz shouted, "Bob's dead. There's no way to get guys up." "Hold it, I'm gonna call topside," Weidrich frantically said, rushing for the phone laying next to Scanlon's body, quickly asking whoever was on the open line where the nearest fresh air was. When told the Jewel shaft, the miner would immediately shrink. "Oh my god, we'll never make it." Schultz tried to force a rebreather on Weidrich, but the man wouldn't take it and quickly fell unconscious. 21-year-old Schultz was then left alone, surrounded by dying and dead men. Taking his last opportunity to live, he picked up another fresh rebreather, stripped his shirt and dunked it in water to wrap his face before literally running for his life down the shaft. He would trip over fallen men in the dark and smoke, but found the strength to continue moving forward. As Robert Lonhart gets off the cage with the breathing apparatuses, he is met by a few of the men waiting to board the hoist and leave, several of whom are trained for mine rescue. "Where are you going with the helmets?" one asked. Robert would explain the request from Gene to get them to the number 10 station, and 3 of the men standing by the exit would demand to accompany him. Rather than take the safety in front of them, Don Beener, Jim Zingler, and Larry Hawkins would go back into the burning mine they had nearly escaped. The makeshift rescue crew would set out toward the number 10, initially on foot until Al Smith would arrive in the train sent to deliver men and retrieve the rescue coming in. Having been already warned about heavy smoke past the timber station, Robert had the men put on their breathing apparatus before entering. As they progressed toward their destination, they reached a wall of black smoke. Robert halts the locomotive to continue to scout on foot and encounters Roger Finley coming out of the haze, clearly distressed but still puffing on a rebreather. Robert asked Jim Zingler to escort him back out to safety. The team, now down to 3, continued slowly on the train. While underway, Lonhart would take an air sample for carbon monoxide concentration. The test had a range of 10 to 3,000 parts per million, indicated by the darkness of a stain in the chemical after a set exposure. With only a quarter of the sample in, the test would turn entirely black. The air was undeniably poisonous and extremely lethal. As they continued down the track, they came across a frantic Byron Schultz gasping through a rebreather. As Larry and Robert begin to set up a breathing apparatus for Schultz, Don Beener removes his own mask, placing it on Schultz, saying, "Here, use this, it's oxygen." In seconds, Don collapses unresponsive onto the hard rock below. Robert and Larry quickly strap an air mask onto Schultz and load him into the timber truck before turning their attention to their fallen fellow rescuer. The men rush to help him and fix his breathing apparatus, but Larry is quickly overcome by air supply issues of his own. The always level-headed miner began to panic, frantically fighting with the air system he wore. "Hit your bypass! Hit your bypass!" Robert shouted. "I did, it didn't work. I have to get out of here," Larry replied as he started rushing toward the exit. Robert was now alone in his rescue efforts. Byron Schultz, now able to speak with the mask over his face, keeps frantically repeating, "They're all dead back there." Robert knows making it to the number 10 now seems impossible. He bends over to lift Don Beener into a muck cart, but immediately finds he lacks the strength to do so. All the adrenaline and fear can't force his muscles to respond through the carbon monoxide poisoning robbing his strength. He makes multiple attempts, but it's no use. With Schultz still deliriously poisoned and panicking in the muck cart, Robert is left with no alternative. There's no way to pick Don up. On the way out, he passes Larry, who jumps into the last cart. As they reach the station, Larry finds the cause of his issue, a hole torn in the hose of his breathing apparatus. Robert is immediately inundated with questions from other miners, the most burning of all, what do we do now? Taking only a moment's rest, Robert regathers his strength and dons a new air tank. They now knew the 3100 level was impassable without full mine rescue equipment, but they weren't sure of the conditions on the 3700 at the time. Recognizing the urgency, George Clapp, Bill Crouch, Stan Taylor, and Ken Tucker insist on accompanying him back into the mine. They moved through good air on the 3700 level until they reached the number 5 shaft. Here they looked on in horror as the black smoke poured out of the shaft and into the airway toward the number 10 shaft, the only means of escape for countless men below. Robert would take another carbon monoxide reading, and here too it was beyond measure and absolutely lethal. Realizing just how grim the outcome may be, hope could still be had. Many miners knew how to construct bulkheads to seal smoke out of an area, or use compressed air lines to repel it. Bill, George, and Ken would venture into the smoke a ways, coming across 5 bodies before turning back for fresh air. This level, like the 3100, would be incompatible with survivors. They make their way back to the surface and find the Bunker Hill hotshot crew was already gearing up to head in. This was a hand-picked team of mine rescuers to act as first responders to mine fires. Robert puts on another fresh air tank as he gives as good of a rundown of the conditions as he can to the rescuers and guides the Bunker Hill team back into the mine. They would go back in looking for survivors, but ultimately collect the 5 bodies on the 3700 before coming back to the surface. The reality begins to set in for everyone outside. Less than half the shift came out of the mine, the only escape routes are filled with impassable black smoke, and most of the mine rescue team, as well as most of the supervisors, are among those still underground. Word about this kind of thing spreads fast in a mining district, and before many had even caught their breath, a U.S. Mining Bureau inspector is already on scene gathering information from escaped miners. Miners from other mines wanting to help or looking for a brother or dad or uncle that was on the forsaken day shift pool into the Sunshine parking lot, soon followed by families and friends of miners at the Sunshine. One of the hardest things many men that survived the fire would ever do was lie. Unwilling to vanquish the hopes of loved ones, many would help reassure them despite knowing the reality of the conditions below. The crowd is kept at a short distance but close enough to see people coming in and out of the mine. They stand by waiting with bated breath as the minutes turn to hours. The first update would finally come that afternoon from Sunshine Mining Company Vice President Wallace Wilson. His statement provided that 5 men had been found dead, 108 evacuated, and 77 unaccounted for. Despite knowing beyond doubt of several more deaths, Sunshine would maintain the policy of waiting until the body was found by rescue crews to add the miner to the total. A torturous task for those participating in rescue efforts, as they were forced to give false hope to relatives of miners they knew had perished. Now, if you're familiar with the final tolls from Sunshine, these numbers don't make much sense. At the time, the methods of attendance taking would be done by the foremen who were present, or by checking to see if their headlamp battery was in place. As many supervisors were still underground, they lacked a reliable counting method, causing the skewed numbers. As the day turned evening into night, multiple attempts were made to get back to the number 10 shaft, but each time the crews were forced back by the immense heat and poison gas. A full tank would buy you 2 hours of air. Smart use practice necessitates an actual work time of about 40 minutes to allow time to get back and to have some grace for emergencies and delays. By the end of the third attempt, it was now 2 a.m. Mine leadership and rescue personnel determined the distance of the shaft was too far to be traveled in these conditions, and they would have to build bulkheads in order to create safe airspaces if they were going to get to the number 10 shaft. The process would take days, alternatives were explored, but not many existed. The only clear way to the lower levels was the number 12 borehole, a 48-inch wide rough wall vent shaft that Sunshine one day hoped to fully expand into a real shaft. Jim Bush and Harvey Dione keenly pulled the cover before evacuating, and it was now the only source of fresh air to the lower levels. The tricky decision to turn off the ventilation fan at 3400 was now left to the rescuers. It's an incredibly difficult decision to make when you aren't sure of how exactly it could affect missing men still underground. Changing air direction could ruin what had previously been a safe air zone. The next morning at 10 a.m., Marvin Chase, the mine manager, would give an update to the families waiting again in the mine parking lot. Rescue crews had found 19 more dead on the 3100 level overnight, but didn't have time to identify them due to the immense heat. He ended stating his continued hope that survivors remained in fresh air pockets deeper in the mine. Desperation was fully setting in for those in charge, and experimental tools were being looked at as possible solutions. Inflatable rubber bulkheads were discussed as one mine inspector present had read about them in a research paper years before. The project had been abandoned. The idea, however, may save precious time, and so several Mining Bureau personnel set out attempting to procure such a product. Another man present inquired about a torpedo cage developed to drop down boreholes in an Atomic Energy Commission test site. The cage was narrow enough, but mine leadership thought the borehole would be too jagged and crooked to make it work. To test, a video camera was lowered down to see how passable the tunnel was, finding it rough but hopeful. Work began, slowly lowering two-man crews in the 38-inch basket. One would hold the cage away from the wall while the other would pry away loose or jagged rock that might prevent their safe descent. The work was strenuous, but help at this point was aplenty. Local rescue crews from Bunker Hill, Galena, Star, and Lucky Friday mines all came to assist. As well, crews from further away, places like Kennecott Copper's Bergen Mine in Eureka, Utah, and the Anaconda Mine in Butte, and even Canadian crews from Kaiser's Resources and Cominco's Sullivan Mine all came to assist in rescue efforts. Government officials pulled in from both state and federal offices, promising to do what they could for the families. Many family members intended to sleep at the mine until they had the answers they desperately needed, and in turn the Red Cross set up a small nurses' station with soft drinks and snacks for the waiting families and volunteer rescuers. Community support quickly ballooned this effort, and soon local churches organized food-making efforts. The Forest Service brought in a truckload of beds, and soon a warm place for people to sleep nearby their loved ones was set up. Clergymen from every denomination arrived from local churches and took on one of the most burdensome tasks, saving the families a public announcement and instead notifying closest family members of men found deceased in the mine in private conversations. Across the Silver Valley, all anyone could do was wait and pray. Every place, be it a store, restaurant, bar, or schoolroom, had a radio on, and everyone in the room would sit silently anytime news from the mine came over the air. Nearly everyone had a husband or dad, a brother and uncle, or a son in the sunshine. If you were lucky, you only had friends to worry about. The news of the disaster gripped not only local mines but national ones as well. As such, the press corps outside the mine was enormous. Dozens of reporters stood by, waiting for news to push out and speaking with relatives and escaped miners. Some of these reporters had less tact to their approach than others. After repeated altercations and one allegedly struck reporter, the News Corps was moved across Big Creek, a short distance away to keep them from pestering families. As rescue crews continue to work on reaching the lower levels of the mine, families continue to pray, but many begin bracing themselves for the worst. A week of waiting and an ever-increasing death toll wore on the onlooking families. Updates were regular from those working below, but often not comforting. The fire had caused multiple cave-ins, severing the compressed air lines and power to lower portions of the mine. The repair necessary on the electric station slowed any progress getting down by the main hoist, but the crew on the number 12 borehole continued their efforts. It would take a full week, but on May 9th the ventilation was restored on the number 10 shaft, allowing a hoist to be repaired for use in searching the lower levels. Around the same time, the crew on the number 12 finally reached the bottom. A fresh crew would be sent down to search for survivors, but came up empty-handed. They would pull out and another crew would lower down to the 4800 level to continue the search. There was no power or compressed air on the level now due to damage from the fire, but the air was clear, giving the crew hopes that someone could still be holding out. At 5:43 p.m. on May 9th, Tom Wilkinson awoke. He and his partner Ron Flory have spent the last week stuck in the dark tunnel. The last week has left them drinking the condensation gathering on a pipe and eating the stale lunches in the dinner buckets left behind by other miners. With nothing but each other and a couple packs of Marlboros to stay sane, it's been tough to say the least. Ron had sworn he could hear voices several times in the past 2 days, but Tom had chalked it up to him losing it in the heat and the dark. But now as Tom's eyes opened in the darkness, he could see dim light bouncing off the rock walls around him. He quickly shakes Ron awake and the partners excitedly rush to their feet, slapping a pipe running along the wall to make extra noise while they fight their boots on. Tom is able to get the lights of a dead motor car to dimly illuminate the 4 men walking towards them in the tunnel. The men would be hoisted back up the number 12 borehole one at a time. Ron would ride up first, but rather than leave with the medics attempting to whisk him out, he refused. "We walked in together, we'll walk out together," he'd flatly tell the others in the room. And with that, he waited while his partner made the slow trip up the skinny borehole. The two would walk out together through the portal, blinded by the daylight and instantly greeted with cheers from the crowd of families onlooking. The men would be mauled by their tear-bound wives and ushered into waiting ambulances before heading off to the West Shoshone Hospital for overnight monitoring, a breakfast atop sirloin and beer courtesy of Governor Cecil Andrews, and finally a long overdue chance to lay on something soft and dry. The jubilation outside the mine was short-lived. The following announcement would reveal 7 more men had been found to add to the toll. With the hoist restored, rescue teams would be able to finally search the remaining working levels. However, the next several days would only see the number of dead rise with no further survivors. Finally, at 6:20 p.m., 10 days after the mine initially caught fire, mine manager Marvin Chase would deliver a shaky announcement. 19 more bodies had been found on the 5,200 and 5,000 levels. The crushed manager told the families to go home, and the company would notify them by phone with any further updates. The crowd erupted in anguish. The tantalizing hope that had been held for a week and a half would finally be crushed. The final 7 missing men would be found just a few hours later. Of the 173 men on the day shift on May 2, 1972, 80 miners escaped, 2 miners survived, and 91 miners would fall victim to the deadly toxic smoke. The mine would be officially closed during the rescue efforts to anyone but those necessary in fighting the fire and conducting searches. The mine would remain closed for months after the fire to address cleanup and safety issues that arose as a result of the damage from the fire. As well, this is the time period the investigations would take place. The government's main investigating body in this case would be the U.S. Bureau of Mines, a regulatory entity that sets safety standards and recommendations for the mining industry. Sunshine Mine would also independently investigate, preparing for the inevitable wave of litigation headed their way. One of the most obvious pressing matters for investigators would be the cause and starting location of the fire. This would not be easily ascertained. The fire had burned through large portions of the 08 and 09 vein from the 3100 level all the way to the 3700 level, not only destroying a lot of what evidence may have existed, but also making the investigation particularly hazardous. Pinpointing the exact location is difficult, but most agree the onset was likely at or near the 3400 to 09 ventilation control bulkhead. Some causes were more easily dismissed than others. This area lacked any electrical workings. As well, smoking in the area would not only be prohibited, but nearly impossible with the airflow the area had. There was a bit of work being done on the level with an oxyacetylene torch being used to cut old rock bolts, but this was being performed 340 feet downwind of the ventilation bulkhead, raising doubts that sparked the inferno. The bulkhead itself was made of plywood and timber, covered with polyurethane foam, an air leak sealing and fire prevention method suggested by the Bureau of Mines and practiced throughout the Sunshine. Another extremely important question to answer was, why was this so deadly? From the first scent of smoke to the final survivors struggling out was hardly more than an hour. Several men in the 3700 pipe shop heard a loud explosion after the initial reports of smoke. Immediately following the sound, a tornado of black smoke overtook the men, 2 of the 3 perishing, and much of the 3700 level would soon follow. What caused the sudden expansion of smoke and gas into the mine? Sunshine's investigators and counsel would make some interesting discoveries while researching the polyurethane foam that the Mining Bureau had certified as safe and suggested for use. The proclaimed self-extinguishing and non-burning properties boasted by the companies providing demonstrations in the early 1960s at the Sunshine Mine and across the globe sounded too good to be true, and they were. The product was Mine Safety Appliances Rigiseal, a rigid sprayed-in-place polyurethane foam. It was intended for sealing air leaks on bulkheads and to improve fire safety. The product was marketed as fireproof, but in reality the polyurethane foam was actually mixed with a fire retardant. The retardant would hinder the performance of the foam, so the minimum amount was added to achieve their non-burning rating. The problem is this only raises the ignition temperature and does nothing to make the product self-extinguishing as claimed. This was made even worse should the product be applied to 2 adjacent surfaces, i.e. a wall and ceiling. If ignited, the foam would create enormous amounts of deadly carbon monoxide. This information was available nearly a decade before the fire, with several more studies confirming in the years leading up to the fire. However, this information was not given to U.S. Bureau of Mines field engineers, who continued to recommend its use. Further studies after the fire by British researchers A.F. Roberts and J.R. Blackwell would find that in horizontal timbered mine openings, fire could progress at a rate of 2.3 to 17.1 yards per hour. In contrast, the non-burning polyurethane foam would progress at a rate of 0.7 to 2.5 yards per second, a rate of up to 3,600 times faster than the plain wood openings. On February 18, 1973, the Bureau would release their report on the causes and lessons to be learned for future safety standards, to immediate pushback from Sunshine's legal counsel. The Bureau's report would cite spontaneous combustion as a cause of the inferno, and would claim lax safety standard adherence led to the avoidable deaths of 91 men. Bureau counsel and author of the book The Price of Silver, James Day, would speculate that spontaneous combustion had occurred behind the bulkhead on 3400, where leftover materials and waste had been stored after the area had been constructed 10 years prior. This fire would burn undetected for days up to weeks before blowing through the bulkhead into the rest of the mine, releasing large amounts of built-up carbon monoxide. Both Day and the Bureau as a whole would deny the foam played any part in the deaths. During a 1973 hearing held by James Day in Coeur D'alenes, Dr. Bernard Lewis would provide expert testimony casting doubt on the theory, stating the bulkhead in question had been put in place in 1962 when construction of the exhaustway was complete, and that due to the area in question's isolation from air movement, the materials in the area likely would have been stabilized at rock temperature around 84 degrees. Any spontaneous combustion would have begun 10 years prior. Adding to the doubt the fire had burnt for an extended time, air leaks through the bulkheads in that area had been identified in an inspection only a few weeks prior to the fire. Had there been smoke being produced, it would have had a route to escape from, preventing buildup and providing an obvious warning before expanding in size. The litigation would stretch for years, with multiple cases running concurrently, with various plaintiffs and defendants. In 1978, U.S. District Court Chief Judge Ray McNichols consolidated 6 cases into one: Helen House et al. V. Mine Safety Appliances et al. This case would see the estates of the deceased miners and the Sunshine Mining Company sue 6 chemical manufacturers and the U.S. government for the misrepresentations of Regiseal made by the manufacturer and the Bureau, causing the deaths of the 91 miners. The plaintiffs and the defendants would agree to a bench trial, feeling the complexity of the fire would be better left to a judge than a jury. The plaintiffs would accuse the Bureau of having knowledge of the dangers presented by the polyurethane foam. During the trial, Sunshine Counsel would call Dr. Donald Mitchell as a hostile witness. Dr. Mitchell had published a research paper in conjunction with U.S. Bureau Mines engineers that proved the severe risk of fire when polyurethane foam was applied on adjacent surfaces. Their findings were published and submitted to the U.S. Bureau Mine engineers for evaluation in 1967, but were never released to the mining industry itself. When called to the stand, Mitchell was pressed on a correspondence between himself and an Iowa dairy farmer. The farmer had recently finished construction of a new barn and was looking to combat the cold winters. The dairyman would go on asking about insulating with polyurethane foam, to which Dr. Mitchell would respond outlining the product's high combustibility and the likely dangers to his cows should they be exposed to the toxic fumes it would produce. When pressed on the inconsistency in warning the dairy farmer but failing to warn the mining industry that they were recommending the product to, his response would be, "I like cows." The defendants would point to Sunshine's lack of standardized rebreather training and alleged poor storage practices allowed for combustible materials to be stored behind the wooden bulkhead. The defense would claim that polyurethane foam had no effect on the fire and did not add to the damage. The case in entirety would last 5 years, but ultimately on June 16, 1978, Judge McNichols would rule against Sunshine and the miners' estates, ruling that the foam was not the proximate cause of any damage, and as such, the chemical companies and U.S. Bureau Mines would not be liable for any of the $660 million that were sought in damages in the suit. In the aftermath of the disaster, the valley reeled. Aside from the obvious 91 lives lost, the following temporary closure of the Sunshine dealt a blow to the job market in the valley. It would be years before the Sunshine could operate at full capacity, and the amount of talent, knowledge, and years of experience lost that year would be irreplaceable. Miners aged 19 to 61 perished that day, and the chilling effect would lead countless more to seek alternative employment, something the state of Idaho set aside funds to assist with. Of the deceased miners' families, more than 30 had left the area by the beginning of the following school year, with 73 fewer students enrolling in Kellogg alone that September. Those that stayed were left shell-shocked by what had happened. A region built on mining meant that every last person knew what was lost. The effects the fire would have on the mining industry as a whole would be felt almost immediately. Soon after the fire, rebreathers and adequate training on their use became a requirement for all mine personnel in hard rock mines across the West. And in 1977, the Federal Mine Safety and Health Act was passed by Congress, requiring multiple clean air intakes, drilled procedures and escape routes, and increased mandatory safety training for miners across the country. Unfortunately, the issues pertaining to polyurethane foam would go largely unaddressed. As always, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat, and in 1986, a miner using an oxyacetylene torch in the Kinross mine of South Africa would accidentally set fire to polyurethane foam used to insulate the walls of the mine from water seepage. The resulting inferno and poisonous carbon monoxide smoke emitted would kill 177 miners. The lamentations words of the Kinross mine manager echoing those of Sunshine's, "They told us it couldn't burn." The Sunshine Mine fire, despite being one of the worst mining disasters in modern history, is poorly understood by most outside the local area. Each year, a 2-minute segment is shown on regional news stations, often chalking the event up as poor safety and a foolhardy belief that rock doesn't burn. In my opinion, a gross mischaracterization. In 1997, in response to multiple ill-informed accounts, and in the interest of preserving the truth about the disaster, mine safety engineer Robert Lonhart wrote a 17-week-long series in the local paper detailing his experience as well as what could be ascertained from depositions and his involvement in the investigations that followed the fire. Bob has never stopped looking for answers in the 5 decades elapsed, and has been more than gracious to take time helping those that wish to understand what happened. Without Bob's immense research and continued efforts, the full story would have been lost decades ago. His generosity with his time and efforts made this documentary possible. The stories of the heroics displayed by many men in the mine will undoubtedly be passed along to my own grandchildren, a reminder that even in the darkest moments you can still be a light for others. On May 2, 1974, a monument of a miner was erected looking into the mouth of Big Creek Gulch, where the Sunshine Mine resides. Upon his head is an eternally lit lamp, and alongside him are 91 markers, each bearing the name of one of the men lost to the smoke that day. Each year on the anniversary, an event is held where folks gather to remember those lost. While I personally tend to avoid crowds, I've always found myself at the monument a few times a year. I like to take time to read each name and finish with a poem penned by Senator Phil Batt. My chest gets as tight reading it today as it did years ago.
We were miners. Our tongues have not tasted the bitter dust. The roar of the drills has never reached our ears. Unfelt to us in the darkness of the shafts, yet we are Idahoans. And we were miners then. We are farmers. We run the water from melted snows onto parched desert soil. The planted seeds take root and grow. The harvest fills our granaries. The pits are strange to us, but we are Idahoans. And we were miners then. We are loggers. We are your neighbors. We share the high country with you, but we sing our song to the buzz of the chainsaws and do our dance on the spinning logs. There's no room in the mine for our trees to fall, but we are Idahoans. And we were miners then. We are cattlemen, innkeepers, merchants, men of the law, and men of the cloth. Ours are 1,000 trades, but only you go into the bowels of the earth to do your daily chores. Yet we are all Idahoans, and we are miners then. Yes, we were miners. We waited in spirit at the mouth of the pit, ached in unison at the news of the dead, joined the jubilation at the rescue of the living, marveled at the poise of the tiny community, and we became strong. The flux of the windows, tears welded your strength into our bodies, and we were all Idahoans, and we were all miners, and we were all proud.
And we are still proud. If you or a close family member were present for the Sunshine Mine fire or the rescue efforts proceeding, I would love to speak to you. History that isn't saved will quickly fade as time passes. Archiving your story offers an opportunity for future generations to learn from our trials without suffering through them personally. Please help me save the stories that make us who we are.